Liberia. Its history begins as a small colony on the grain coast of Africa as mere bits of land bought up by Jehudi Ashman from tribes of the region with the ambition of establishing an American empire. Ashman would utilize strong-handed and intimidation-style tactics in his negotiating, managing to secure Cape Monserrato in exchange for European goods. Ashman and the American Colonization Society had intended on creating this American colony to facilitate the establishment of a free land for African Americans who would otherwise be free in the United States, but subject to social, political, and legal limitations within the state and community. The colony would become a core asset of the African repatriation movement and an opportunity to carve out a civilization based upon freedom without fear of discrimination and persecution. Something which was met with a good deal of enthusiasm by many within the circle of abolitionists, and criticism by others who sought instead to push for inclusiveness within the European American society instead of develop their own. Efforts to craft of Liberia and African America were underway, but just as with the settlement of the Americas, so were the settlers met with aggression from the local tribes, as well as the hardships that come with establishing a new nation and civilization out of raw, untapped lands. The next few decades would see the US government indirectly involve itself in the development of Liberia, offering citizenship to those freed from illegal slave ships captured by the US, and offering security to the colony from neighboring threats. By the 1840s, Liberia had become a wholly independent state, with Joseph Jenkins Roberts as its first president, soon earning the international recognition of the UK and other major states, from France to Bavaria, though it would not come to be recognized as independent by the US until the mid-1860s, when calls were once again made for the now emancipated African Americans to return to Africa to help in the development of Liberia into a first-class nation. From the very beginning, something of a class structure was forming within the Liberian population, most notably between the African Americans, or Americo-Liberians as they'd come to be known, and of course the native African tribesmen. The Americo-Liberians were typically well-educated, well-mannered, and Christian. The native tribes weren't exactly that. Heck, odds are these very same tribes were the ones who had sold the ancestors of the Americo-Liberians into the transatlantic slave trade. Attempts were made to civilize and convert the tribesmen, but with little success, and with much met aggression, leading the two to separate, with a few natives who remained in Liberia to fall into the bottom of the class hierarchy, while attempts to either integrate or simply separate continued on in Roberts' presidency. He would in his time oversee the expansion of Liberia and the acquisition of new lands through purchase and conquest, while developing good relations with the European nations and maintaining close ties to the United States. Schools and medical facilities would be established, as well as the University of Liberia, of which Robert was a founder, also teaching as a professor of international law. He'd later go on to serve as a major general in the Liberian army before returning to office nearly 2 decades later. Unfortunately for both Roberts and Liberia, he fell ill and passed away just when the nation would need his guidance most. Liberia had great ambitions of expanding beyond its meager borders to become a United States of Africa, but without Roberts' vision and a solid plan in play, Liberian industry and production plummeted, relations with the German Empire soured ties to Britain and France, who held colonies neighboring Liberia and made conscious efforts to restrict Liberian growth. As American emancipation failed to bring the population boom Liberia desperately needed to fuel production of more goods, so was Liberia forced to resort to menial resource extraction and exportation of their primary resource, natural rubber. The nation was on the brink of greater industrialization, which could have made it a common player on the international scene, but this failed to fall through on account of a lack of leadership, an inability to attract more citizens from the US, and mismanaged international policies. By 1920, it'd be discovered by the League of Nations that Liberia's conditions had become so poor that they resorted to imposing forced labor upon the native African tribes of the region. Things would generally remain poor for Liberia, as it would appear the whole world had forgotten about it, even its parent nation, the United States, and nothing would improve until it finally became necessary to do so again in the 1940s. The US finally investing heavily into modernizing the nation and building all the infrastructure needed for Liberia to become prosperous once again, reviving its failed economy. The 1950s would see Liberia rise again on the world scene, championing in the era of civil rights the ideal of Pan-Africanism, something which would be echoed back in the US by groups such as the Nation of Islam and the earlier peace movement of Ethiopia, the latter of which too sought repatriation to Liberia for the strengthening of the Liberian state. Liberia would play an important role in developing African unity and promoting independence from the European powers, but things would come to a boil in the late 1970s. Tensions between the Americo-Liberians and indigenous populations were brewing. The Americo-Liberians were an elite class, wealthy and well-educated. The indigenous populations again, not so much. Despite liberal reforms and attempts by the new president, William Tolbert, to bring more of the indigenous majority into the government, he had become grossly unpopular, perceived as a corrupt nepotistic leader by the indigenous population on one hand, and accused of, quote, letting the peasants into the kitchen by the Americo-Liberians on the other hand. Tolbert set term limits unlike his predecessors, who often served for the entirety of their lives. He also restored the two-party system after Liberia's centuries-long existence under one-party rule, and began a process of constructing new houses for the impoverished indigenous class. But ultimately, Tolbert and his government were overthrown in a violent coup, which began a period of infighting between the numerous indigenous groups and mass persecution of the Americo-Liberians that would continue until the early 2000s, leaving the nation a shaken shadow of the potential it once held. But what if all that changed? The opportunity to improve the path Liberia is set upon presents itself a number of times, but we'll be taking things from the mid-20th century. Specifically, we'll be exploring what was known as the Greater Liberia Act, a proposed bill by Mississippi Governor Theodore G. Bilbo, which would have, in exchange for the compulsory repatriation of African Americans to Liberia, provide reparations for slavery at the expense of the U.S. federal government. At the time, this had received the support of Pan-Africanist and black advocate Marcus Garvey, as well as some within Congress who believe this may alleviate the unemployment of the Depression by freeing up jobs in the U.S., while stimulating business and development within Liberia at the very same time. Of course, it was met with controversy from those who speculated it was a plot to expel the African diaspora from the Americas, but to this, Garvey and Bilbo explained that it was in the best interest for black Americans to establish a society and government all their own, free from the discrimination and intolerance of the Americas. This controversy, along with a lack of support, would lead the bill to fade into obscurity, while only a decade later, during the height of the Civil Rights era, so did this very same argument come into vogue between the views of integration championed by MLK and the calls of total separation put forth by Malcolm X. What we'll suggest for this timeline is that the bill garnered just enough popularity to leave the issue deadlocked but keen in the public eye throughout the 1940s, thus bringing it into the Civil Rights era, the same period of time that saw the continued growth and development of Liberia into an increasingly attractive home with potential to grow and build. Governor Bilbo and Garvey's time would have passed, but the Greater Liberia Bill would survive them, gaining a great deal of support from Americo-Liberians looking to bolster their numbers and finally fashion the sustainable state they'd hoped for. The bill would also gain widespread support from separatists like Malcolm and Governor George Wallace. Governor George Wallace would announce his candidacy for president and proceed to run against Lyndon B. Johnson for the Democratic primary, as he had done in our timeline. Once again, it's a matter of separation from Wallace's side and integration from Johnson's side. We'll suggest that Wallace is able to utilize the popularity and controversy of the Liberia Bill to garner more attention and support from black voters who wouldn't have voted for him otherwise, while at the same time making Johnson out to be the one attempting to keep Liberia down and prevent African Americans from having their own home free of American intolerance. It may not be all too significant, but it was another crack in Johnson's campaign, enough to secure the primary and easily outcompete Barry Goldwater by flipping the South in his favor, earning him the presidential seat and pushing forward the Greater Liberia Bill and beginning the largest migration Liberia would ever see. Of course, many would leave freely, happy to take their handsome reparations check and begin life in their new homeland, or they'd also be helped to find a job and provided residency in a newly built home by the Liberian government. However, certainly not everybody would be so ready to give up the homes and lives they've made in the US, leading hostile African American enclaves and militant groups to form in small pockets of the southeast, determined to hold onto the land by any means necessary, while they gradually found themselves isolated and alone. Liberia, on the other hand, would prosper as new skilled citizens arrived to fill the many needs and functions of the state. President William Tubman had during this period developed an open-door policy with the United States to bring foreign businesses into Liberia to stimulate the economy, which meant a good deal of the migrants were able to simply transfer their current jobs to one overseas. Railways and roads would be built, along with the establishment of a free port to encourage greater trade with the rest of the world, leading the Liberian economy to boom and usher in a greater age of prosperity than ever seen in our timeline. All the while, neighboring countries began to violently break away and fall into chaos. Liberia and the United Nations believed that they could lead through example, but gradually as it became apparent the newly independent African regimes were favoring the USSR, so did the patience of the West wear out. Meanwhile, President Tubman's expansionist ambitions kicked in. Guinea and Sierra Leone were ripe for the picking. Both had recently gained independence and were facing internal strife that was seemingly shifting them toward communism. Restabilization and containment would be used to justify Liberia's invasion and occupation of these lands. In this timeline, the US does involve itself in Vietnam, but withdraws soon after, as Wallace had previously stated that if the conflict in Vietnam was not winnable within his first year in office, that he would immediately withdraw all US troops, while also demanding that European and Asian allies paid their fair share into the International Defense Fund, asserting that America remained on the defensive to protect itself instead of going on the offensive, conserving troops that he believed were wasted in conflicts that didn't secure American interests. Liberia, having secured Sierra Leone and Guinea, now has access to a rich supply of diamonds, metal ores, and fish, which serve to strengthen the economy and provide more resources to both export and work with, becoming a prime competitor with the Ivory Coast and cementing Liberia's position as a capable world power. After over a century, the nation would finally reach the position it had so longed for, and with neighboring Pan-African states, lay the groundwork of the Organization for African Unity and the soon-to-form African Union. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.